I experienced a significant number of amazing events, especially during the Battle for Way.
Yeah.
This was unprecedented in the war. It turned into a major urban battle, and we were not prepared for that. I basically, as a leader, in the first day of the fight, lost my entire command, primarily because two reasons. Number one, the enemy we were facing were there in force. They were not leaving. They were going to stay. And they were very well trained and very effective as warfighters. But the second reason was because our military leadership was forced to follow the principles of our political leadership and the leadership of South Vietnam.
Yeah.
Did not want to see this beautiful city destroyed. And I do understand that sentiment. But for the first 6 days of the fight in phase one, the south side of the river, and the first 3 days of our fight, essentially that meant that we as Marine warfighters had our hands tied behind our backs. We were not allowed to use any form of heavy weapons, which is the way we had learned how to fight, learned how to train to fight, and the way we had fought every single day leading up to that moment. So those memories of those things that I witnessed, they'll never go away, Preston.
Yeah.
They are here with me, and they will be there with me for the rest of my life. When I arrived in the Republic of Vietnam in November of 1967, we were fighting a guerrilla war. Oftentimes it was hit and run. Our enemy was predominantly the VC, the Viet Cong, the insurgents, if you will.
Yeah.
Who sometimes might have a squad, might have a platoon, but oftentimes you got two guys in a rice paddy with one rifle and 5 rounds. But they also were very good at digging up our unexploded ordnance and turning it into improvised explosive devices. We call them detonated bombs.
Yeah.
And so you would be out on patrol in a quote-unquote friendly area, meaning that the village that was right next to our combat base seemed friendly in the daytime. And all of a sudden, boom, you've lost 4 Marines, and you've gotten into a short but vicious firefight, and then the enemy disappears. The battle for Way City was a dramatically different fight. One of the interesting, the military likes to use buzzwords. The common term for urban warfare is called MOUT, military operations on urban terrain. But it doesn't really describe what you're dealing with as a warfighter, as a Marine, as a grunt. The term I like is fishing, F-I-S-H, stands for fighting in someone's house.
Mm-hmm.
So if you think about that, we went from being out in rice paddies and jungles and mountains with an occasional, sometimes it would happen every day, but often you would go for a week or even longer without a round being fired, without anything bad happening, and then boom, in Way, every single minute of every single day, during the daytime, thank heavens, someone was trying to kill you at close quarters. So the challenge was not only that you're fighting in a city, and oftentimes in 2- and 3-story buildings, pretty substantial structures.
Yeah.
But there were people there that were hiding from us and hiding from the enemy. But when you made contact with the enemy, as opposed to often in the bush, you would make contact from 100 meters or even further in Way, in a city fight. Oftentimes that close combat, that contact, the initial contact is 20 yards away.
Wow.
And you're not good at reacting quickly and effectively. You're at a serious disadvantage. The fighting in Way City was unprecedented. This was the first time since the battle for Seoul during the Korean War, the first phase of the Korean War, if you will, and in that particular urban combat, which was the last time Marines had been in urban combat, the dynamics were a little different because of what had happened leading up to the fighting in Seoul. The North Korean army at that point in time were actually trying to leave Seoul as fast as possible. And recognized that if they did not get out of there, they could literally be cut off and wiped out or taken, captured. So they were trying to leave. It was an exfiltration kind of a movement. They weren't standing and fighting. In the battle for Way, according to the North Vietnamese plan, their intent during the Tet Offensive of 1968 was not only to wage unprecedented attacks on the cities, but they were going to stay there. Their expectation was that the local populace would rise up and join them to drive the American forces and the South Vietnamese forces into the South China Sea. They were not going anywhere. So it was a completely different dynamic. And one of the interesting things that happened leading up to the first contact on the first day we got inside the Citadel, which was the 12th of February, when we received our orders and we understood what we were facing, I did a quick survey of my squad leaders. I asked them, how much training have you had in urban warfare during your time in the Marine Corps so far?
Yeah.
The standard answer was a couple hours.
Yeah, wow.
As opposed to insurgency, counterinsurgency, where we had spent days and days and weeks and months training for fighting out in the bush, fighting in the jungle, fighting in the villages. This was an entirely different dynamic. I counted my own experience, and I spent 12 months in the Marine Corps going through various phases of training, and my count was 4 hours of urban warfare training. So not only was this different, but we really were not effectively trained. We had to kind of just go at it and trial and error and see what works and see what doesn't work. And usually in combat, when you're faced with trial and error, a lot of people are going to get killed.
Yeah, and as you describe it, you know, unlike what you described in Korea, where the North Koreans are pulling out of Seoul, there's urban combat, but they're pulling out. You describe in your memoir, you know, the North Vietnamese forces who've had a couple weeks to entrench themselves. I mean, of course, they go into Way, as they go into many places throughout South Vietnam on January 31st. You get there, if I remember correctly, February 12, I think you said, and your fighting, I believe, starts February 13.
That's correct.
And if I, you know, and you mentioned when you're out in the bush, you know, you may get shot at from 100 yards away or something like that. But correct me if I'm wrong, but I think most of your memoir really involves taking basically 4 blocks, right? Moving, is that right? Moving from what you call one phase to the next, but the phases correspond with streets and Way. Do I have that correct? Really, roughly about a week to take 4 city blocks.
You're right. Our battle space was the southeast corner of the Citadel Fortress. If you look at the map, it is 4 blocks wide between the outer wall of the Citadel and the inner wall of the Imperial Palace, and it is 7 blocks deep. So we had a total of 28 blocks in our area of responsibility that we were assigned to find and destroy the enemy and clear that area. It actually took 3.5 days of all-out combat to get across the first phase line, because up until that point, we were fighting without any kind of heavy weapons. We were simply doing frontal assaults against a huge enemy force that was waiting for us in force, and we could not fight the way we had been trained, which is Marine Corps fights using a concept called Marine Air Ground Task Force. It is grunts, the infantry, supported by airstrikes. Usually the airstrikes come in advance and don't destroy, but badly debilitate the enemy in front of us.
Yeah.
And we also had the use of artillery and other high explosive heavy weapons. And one of the arts of fighting as a Marine Air Ground Task Force is to be very coordinated, because if you get ahead, or and the heavy weapon can kill you just as fast as it kills the enemy. The other challenge is, I actually went back to Vietnam in 1998 and visited the Citadel Fortress, and I went to that street. The street is named Mai Thuc Nguyen. It's the name of some famous ancient Vietnamese general.
Yeah.
And I paced the distance from the front door of the house that my troops ended up in to the front door of the house right across the street where the enemy was waiting for us in force. 24 paces. So this is a very short distance, but it's completely exposed. There's no cover between the front door of my house and the front door of his house.
Yeah.
You consider the U.S. Marine, whose job it is to attack across that street and destroy the enemy in that house. It's a two-story house, and on the very first contact, there were enemy troops in every single window, every single door, every single roof, and also they had prepared. They had, as you mentioned, 2 weeks to prepare for us inside the Citadel. They had dug very effective fighting holes in the spaces between the houses.
Yeah.
We are facing a matrix of deadly enemy gunfire, and oftentimes there were not just one, but 2 or 3 enemy soldiers with automatic weapons in each of these positions.
Yeah.
So it was a very, very difficult and challenging situation. Here we are on the 12th of February now, inside the Citadel. We managed to find our way inside the Citadel without shooting them, without a round being fired. And now we're being told again that your mission is to destroy the enemy holding the Citadel Fortress away, and you can't use heavy weapons. You've got to use what you're carrying, your rifles. We could use the M40 grenade launcher, which is like a hand grenade, but that was it. We were carrying bazookas with us, the World War II, famous bazookas, as well as the new one, the fold-up one. But we were under direct orders, so we could not use those.
Yeah.
We had 4 M48 tanks with us with 90 millimeter cannons. But the cannons, the tank commanders were told, direct orders, you cannot fire your cannon. You can use your machine guns, you can't fire your cannons. So that lasted for 3 days. Fortunately, a very famous Marine general came into Da Nang on the 16th of February and wanted to know why the casualty reports were so high and why progress was not being made. And the Marine leadership told the Marine general, this is why, we're under direct orders, it's coming from Westmoreland, we can't use heavy weapons. The story that I heard, which came from his son, and I believe it, is that he looked out the window and looked at an F-4 jet with a Marine emblem on it and said, who does that belong to? And they said, well, it's the Stars, sir. And he says, who does this artillery belong to? He said, the Stars. He said, you start using it, you support our guys. Anybody gives you any crap, you send them to me.
Yeah.
Lieutenant General Krulak.
About, I don't know, I think about halfway through or so, you begin fairly regularly to refer to these 2 aspects of yourself as a Marine officer. One is the automaton, and the other is the human. And you talk about how in certain instances, the human has certain impulses and certain thoughts, but then the automaton is just being the automaton. Can you just describe that for us? Just what comes to mind when you think about what you wrote, this sort of, you've got these 2 sort of beings at work within your one body, the automaton and the human being. What is that about?
I'll try to explain it to you the best I can.
Yeah, to the extent you can, sure, yeah.
It actually, I discovered the automaton on the night of the 15th of December, 1967.
Mm.
No, I'm sorry, the 10th of December, 1967. When one of our squads, we were in Hoi An, one of our squads went on a night ambush patrol and got blown out by a command detonated bomb. And my company commander turned to me and said, form up a reaction team, get out there as fast as you can, take an extra corpsman, because we don't know if the corpsman's been injured or killed. And I did that. I took a dozen or so Marines with my platoon sergeant, John Mother Mullen, Staff Sergeant Mullen, and we ran out. We violated all protocol. We just said the important thing here is to get there as quickly as possible, because the squad leader was badly wounded and ended up dying on a helicopter on the way into the main. And I'm out there, and I'm really seeing carnage for the first time. I've been in country since mid-November. This was the first time that I had seen serious injuries, people with no arms, limbs missing, dead bodies, and so forth. And I was in command now, and my job was to control the situation, secure it, call in the medevac helicopter, provide security for the landing zone so that they can get these young kids to safety and to medical assistance as quickly as possible. And when I first looked at this young man, his name was Boyce, Lance Corporal, young married guy, just came back from R&R. It was the happiest Marine in the whole company, and now here he is. Something changed inside of me.
Mm.
And I, for the first time, realized that this was very real. This is horrible. This is war. And I met the automaton. And I can't really explain it to you other than to say that as my tour progressed, and in particular at one moment and at other moments during the battle for the way, the automaton took control. And I was basically, on the 13th of February, 1968, in the midst of this unbelievably chaotic day, when I'm there, I see the dynamic. I understand that what I'm being told to do is insane, makes no sense whatsoever. I am screaming, I'm yelling, I'm cursing over the radio, trying to get my company commander's attention, trying to get the battalion commander's attention to understand if you continue this, all you're going to accomplish is getting more and more and more Marines killed and devastated. I went into this. This was after the first, we made contact, we lost a lot of guys. Then we were ordered assault, get across the street, got to make a beachhead. And the redeeming grace of this story, Preston, is that every single time that I had to give the order to assault, my men knew this was stupid. They knew it was crazy. And yet, they stood up and they charged and they went into the gunfire. And way too many of them were killed and wounded that day. Mm-hmm. My platoon was decimated. I took in 51 guys, including myself, 3 U.S. Navy corpsmen, 2 radio operators, and my platoon sergeant. My platoon sergeant was shot in the head. We thought he was dead. That was a huge loss. And nobody's listening to me. They're not listening to me.
You mean the higher ups?
Higher. We call them higher.
Yeah.
Command. And after the first assault, So this is the second contact with the enemy and more loss. I became unable to perform. I was completely devastated. And the only thing I could do is I walked into a back room and there was a rocking chair and I sat in a rocking chair. I don't know how long I sat in that rocking chair.
Mm.
It was either a couple of minutes or it was 15 minutes or 10 minutes. I don't know. But I was completely undone. No longer fit for command at that moment.
Yeah.
And so my mind took me back to a safe place for a few minutes. And then my radio operator came and shook my shoulder and said, "Lieutenant, they want us to attack again."
Mm.
And from that moment forward, throughout that entire battle, the automaton took control. So I was able to function. I was able to perform. And the only thing that I can tell you is that looking back on this, I'm grateful that it took control of me, that I was able to function. Because I go to reunions now every year. I look forward, and I see these guys, the ones who survive, often with terrible wounds, but they survived, they healed. And they shake my hand and they hug me. They love me.
There's another pairing that I noticed, or another on the one hand this, on the other hand that, that appears in the memoir. And they have to do with decisions. And one decision that you seem to get right, and the other decision that you seem to conclude that you didn't get right. And the one decision you got right, and again, correct me if you don't agree with my assessment, but that there was a Marine who was dead. You were certain that the Marine was dead. I believe it was a sergeant who came in and said, "We've got to get that Marine out of the street." And you're just saying, and your response is basically, "I'm not putting anybody at risk to go get that dead Marine right now. We can take care of that Marine later. We don't have to get him now. You go out there, you're going to get killed." The sergeant basically insists, and goes out and pays a very heavy price for that. That's on the one hand, that's the decision where I think in retrospect that sergeant knows that you made the right call, although you let him go. But then on the other side, I don't remember the exact details, but there was an officer who wanted you to make a raid on to take a building, if I remember correctly. And your response was similar in that first case, that's a suicide mission, and I'm not going to volunteer for that. But then others do volunteer, and the operation ends up going very well. And in your memoir, you say that, that actually that was a very significant event. So I'm just interested in your response as you reflect on these two decisions. One where you can look back and say, "I got that right, and I wish that sergeant had listened." In the other case, well, I guess in that case, my assessment wasn't perfect. What I'm just interested in hearing you bounce off that.
Sure, let me kind of fill in some details.
Okay. Yeah.
First of all, in the first case, that was Staff Sergeant Robert Odom, O-D-U-M, from Louisiana. Good man. He was the platoon sergeant of the platoon on my right flank. He saw that Marine go down. So did I. So did our U.S. Navy corpsman who was fixing another Marine at the time in the midst of this hail of gunfire. Believe me, had that Marine been wounded and suffering and needed help, we would have done everything we could. But I looked at the doc, who had a direct line of sight. He saw him get shot in the head. He knew he was dead in a doornail. And so when Sergeant Odom came over, now I understand, I love Robert Odom, okay. When we first met for the next time at a reunion in 1998, we both kind of approached each other very cautiously because we didn't know, if there was still a lot of emotion there and how we would react to each other.
Yeah.
But Bob Odom was going by tradition. We don't leave a man behind.
Right.
I understand that. But we had already seen this dynamic where one of my Marines go down. Uh, One of the early stories in the book, right after the first contact with the enemy, is Ed Estes going after his buddy Robert Morgan, and he was killed. And Bob Morgan, we tried a couple of times to get him. He was actually dead by the time Ed got to him, but now Ed's dead. So I know that was the right call because we knew that tonight, after dark,
Yeah.
we'll get a couple of brave Marines who will go out there and pull that man, and we will get him home. Okay. But Bob Odom, traditional career Marine, just couldn't stand it. We got to go get him. And so I don't really regret today that I gave him the go-ahead. You go ahead and we'll give you as much supporting fire as we can, because he survived. And he learned that my view of that situation was all we're doing is sending more good Marines into a meat grinder with no possible positive outcome. It just was going to be impossible. That Marine was dead and he was completely exposed. It would take several seconds to be out in the middle of the street and you got that matrix of gunfire. Somebody's going to shoot you, okay? And it turned out Bob tried to sneak around the tank and he got hit. I think it was right here, with a round that came from probably a second-story window.
Wow.
But it blew off the bottom of his face. And when he crawled back, I saw what had happened to him. I was devastated. That's one of the things I don't like to remember. The battle for Way City, the Citadel Fortress of Way, essentially was fought in daytime hours. Very little happened at night. And I think it was mutual acclamation. Both us and our enemies recognize that what we're dealing with in broad daylight is scary enough. And let's just, kind of tucker down here, secure our positions, and get a good night's sleep. And then we'll deal with it when dawn arrives.
Yeah.
It was dynamic, with the exception of this one night. This has been going on for the better part of a week. And we're now on the third phase line facing. We had been fighting on this phase line, this street, which would be the 3rd Street south from Mines-Hook Long, or phase line green. So we had crossed green, we had crossed, I think there was orange and then black, and we're on that one. We're looking to cross the street and get into the 3rd row of blocks. And the dominant terrain feature was a 3-story schoolhouse. And it was typical. These blocks had not cinder block walls, but they were made of concrete, but they weren't solid. They were decorative, okay? And throughout the day, and maybe even the day before, we had been having major firefights across that street with the enemy, who were dug in right behind that decorative wall. So we're now 30 meters apart. We're fighting. We know they're there. What Scott figured was when the lights turn out, they're probably doing the same thing we are, which is pulling back a little bit and going into upstairs bedrooms and doing what we call 50-50, which is half of your men are awake, the other half are asleep, and you trade off halfway through the night. And it turned out he was right. These guys had been leaving those fighting positions and going and getting in the schoolhouse, which was probably, I'd say, 30 or 40 meters behind the wall. So the front steps of the schoolhouse, this is a substantial building. This is a schoolyard, they had been every night after it's dark going into that first floor of that schoolhouse. and going to sleep, keeping some watch. And, but that's, that's hindsight, okay? We didn't,
Sure. Yeah.
didn't know that.
Know that at the time.
My expectation is they're sitting there in those foxholes. They're waiting for us.
Sure.
So he came and he called me in, and I went in and he said, listen, I want to try to do a night movement. It's a surprise kind of a tactic. It's a hairy thing to do. You got to have surprise on your side. But I think we can be successful, and I want you to lead it. I want you to volunteer to lead it. That's the way he put it. And I looked at him and I said, Scott, no, I call him Skipper. I said, I will lead this, but I'm not going to volunteer to lead it. You're going to have to give me a direct order, because this is, excuse me, fucking crazy. This is suicide. Whoever goes on this is going to die. Everybody's going to die. And so he kind of looked at me. I said, no, I'm not going to order you to do it. I said, it's the only way I'm doing it. And so what he did was he went back to the rear and talked to the battalion commander and gave him the idea. And the battalion commander called a different company commander, the company commander for Alpha Company, who volunteered a Marine staff sergeant, and I will remember his name in a minute, a little short guy. He was really a good one, to take a 15 or 16 man squad on this night movement. At 2 o'clock in the morning, here they come through our rear line, and Scott and I looked every single man in the eye. We made him jump up and down, is there anything rattling, cinching straps, or are you, and I looked at every single one of them in the eye, and every single one of them looked at me and said, I'm about to die, okay? I mean, they didn't say it, but you could read it in their face. But they went, and they went across that street that had been under heavy fire for the better part of a week, and the NBA had pulled back, and they went not just into the first floor, but the rear part of the building. And this is like a typical schoolhouse, a 3-story schoolhouse, and there's a set of stairs right at the front door. And Marines are taught that if you're going to have to take a house that's 3 stories high, what you try to do is get up to the 3rd floor as fast as possible. They snuck in the front door. They snuck up the stairs. Nobody was up on the 3rd floor.
Mm.
And so when first light came that next morning, you got 15 or 16 heavily armed and motivated Marines in command of the 3rd floor of the schoolhouse, and everything behind the schoolhouse, nobody was being worried about being shot or anything. They're just lounging around and going here and there. And they piled up a bunch of bodies. I mean, and the enemy, recognizing that they had been fooled and they had been, snookered basically, immediately pulled back to the next phase line. Looking around behind our lines, making sure of things. And this NBA soldier, young guy, had obviously fallen asleep and his had pulled back. And now he's all by himself, and here he comes. And they see him kind of coming, and they get on 2 sides of like a hedgerow or something like that, and they pounce on him. And he put his hands up, dropped his weapon, put his hands up, and they bring him to me, which is what they're supposed to do. And in that moment, I could see 2 things. Number one, I could see the smile on his face. He was happy. He knew it was over for him. And the other thing I could see was all the Marines that I had lost, all the terrible wounds that my Marines had suffered. And all I could think about was those Marines and the stupid smile on this kid's face. Mm-hmm. And I basically, the human took control, and all I wanted to do was kill him.
Mm.
I was enraged that he could be maybe one of the guys that shot Sergeant Mullen, maybe one of the guys that killed Ed Estes. And here he is going, oh, I'm good, I'm good, I'm fine.
Mm-hmm.
And I took him down, and you're right, I had my hands around his neck, and I was going to choke him to death. But that's the moment when my Marines and their training took over.
Mm-hmm.
And they were shocked. So there was a second or two before they took action, because I'm the one telling them, you can't do this shit. Because we had the 15th of December when we lost the squad. One of my squads went out the next day on a patrol, and I watched their progress from a distance, because they were lighting hooches on fire out in a quote-unquote friendly village. And when they got back, I chewed their ass out. You can't do that. That's just making a bad situation worse. So, I'm the lieutenant. I'm the guy who's telling them, no, you can't do this stuff. And here I am trying to kill this kid.
Yeah.
They did the right thing, thank God. They pulled me off. And then they just took him back to the rear with the S2 shot and questioning and so forth. One of the worst parts of my memories was watching that tank run over that NVA soldier the first time. And I didn't ever look at that guy after that throughout the rest of the battle. But I remember that I think maybe I saw him get run over a couple of times, but he had literally been run over. I put myself in the tank driver's shoes. They had lost friends. There's this dead body. It's just a dead body. It's organic lump. And, you have this, every one of us has this really black part of our soul. And you don't ever, hopefully people don't ever discover it. But when you're in combat like this, you see things. You perhaps even do things that are just the worst things in the world. And you see that darkness, that blackness. And so I do understand why the tank drivers did that. After the first couple of times, they just went, yep, we're going to run over them again. I remembered watching, and I remembered where it was. And I went there, and I found that it was like 3 feet long and maybe 15 inches wide, tattered bits of green khaki. It was a grease spot. And so we had been burning bodies, basically. I mean, there's nothing else you can do. You just don't have a graves registration group, And
Sure.
so we poured some gasoline on it and lit it. And I remember that it was a moment when I have to say that oftentimes the enemy that we faced in Vietnam, the VC, the command detonated bomb guys, you just don't have a lot of respect for them.
They're not wearing uniforms, hit and run tactics.
Right. They were very difficult to detect because they look like everybody else.
Could be a 15-year-old kid, right?
Yep. But the NVA who fought in the Battle for Way, they were soldiers. They were professional soldiers. I know that's not true of all of them. I've read books from the NVA perspective, and I know that oftentimes they're drafted. They come into the mill and they say, okay, you're now in the Army. But there are stories like that with Americans too. But they did. They stood, they fought, and they were very, very tough, very determined. And in that particular war, that particular phase of the war, those battles, you try to put yourself over on the other side and look at it through their shoes, and they were often indoctrinated in that this is the Americans are the invaders. They don't belong here. They're dominating our cousins and friends and uncles and aunts down in the South, and we have to free them. So that's a different perspective.
Yeah.
But just at that moment, I don't know why, but I feel like I had to show some respect. This is a soldier being cremated. I am glad that I survived.
Yeah.
Having said that, I carry a lot of survivor's guilt. If I had done this instead of that, if you second guess it, and I'm still doing that to this day.